This podcast was made possible by the kind support of Blue Vista Capital Management, a London-based specialist investment advisor and placement boutique. Our next guest believes in seizing the day, and he has seized opportunity time and time again. From creating impact in community banking, the Chicago Mayor's Office, to a real estate fund with its eye on current trends. Find out more next. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Aaron Joseph, who is Senior Vice President, Investor Solutions at Blue Vista Capital Management, a Chicago-based real estate investment manager focused in particular on middle market equity, student housing, and real estate credit. He previously worked as Deputy Sustainability Officer in the Office of the Mayor in the City of Chicago and as a Strategy Manager at Urban Partnership Bank, focused on providing banking services for impact capital and urban real estate investors. Welcome, Aaron. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Aoife. It's great to join you on the show. I've enjoyed being a listener, and you've captured so many compelling interviews with people I admire and introduced me and your audience to other voices that don't get heard. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Well, we're going to start by keeping this very local because I understand that you grew up not far from where we're sitting today and where I'm sitting today. So where did you grow up and what did you study and how did the investing world make itself open to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's right. I grew up in Oak Park, Illinois. It's a progressive enclave just west of Chicago. I've since returned to Oak Park in recent years. My parents were both immigrants. My mother, a farm girl from the plains of Saskatchewan in Canada, and my father from a tiny town in Trinidad and Tobago. He arrived with a fifth grade education. So my mother was white and my father was black, and they met in the bohemian neighborhood of Old Town in Chicago, shortly after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64. So being a mixed race couple, when they wanted to settle and form a family, Oak Park was really one of the only places that they would have felt safe doing so. Activists in Oak Park had long fought against redlining and racist housing policies, and it's a very diverse place, and it still is to this day. So, my father worked in sales, and my mother owned a children's bookstore, and they're really entrepreneurs and dreamers, and I think that led me to really an entrepreneurial career in real estate, to this day. And I studied art history, at the University of Wisconsin, and that's played a huge role in my career as well.
I want to ask about that because I've heard great things about the perspective that art history can give a mind. And I'd love to learn what interested you in that. And do you see the world differently because of that?
Yeah, I agree with that. From a real estate perspective, I think, studying the architectural styles and history of the architecture had led me to my interest in real estate and sustainability and historic preservation. Sort of from a practical skills standpoint, I think, I learned how to write in studying the field. And then also to appreciate and understand different viewpoints and cultures. I mean, essentially, I think that's kind of the big picture outcome of a classical liberal arts education, teaching you how to think, not what to think. So you're moving into real estate. It seems to have come after a few different steps in your career. Where did you go right after college? And was that using your art history, or had you already made the leap into business at that stage? Right. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question because I actually went into engineering. I was a consulting engineer, working in design and construction and really focused on sustainability. Sustainability is all, part of that progressive upbringing, but it's, I'd say it was always I saw it as a growth opportunity in business. So I became, LEED accredited as a professional in 2004 and worked on green buildings and ESG, has skyrocketed since that time. But I got into that business, really through the ground floor, doing the drafting work. And it was really kind of a very hands-on approach to real estate. And so that tangible nature that sometimes people, talk about the asset class, I really lived that from the beginning of my career.
Can we then move to the Urban Partnership Bank experience? Because it seems that impact was very much a part of that. Can you describe the kind of impact that bank was seeking to have?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Urban Partnership Bank, I joined actually at its predecessor institution, which was called Shore Bank. And Shore Bank was a pioneering institution in the impact investing world. They drew capital from many leading endowments and foundations to support anti-redlining lending in the south and west sides of Chicago, where there were qualified banking clients that were underserved, in black and brown neighborhoods. In the washout of the great financial crisis, I came on as a consultant to help recapitalize the bank. And ultimately that led to the formation of Urban Partnership Bank as creating a new bank holding company from the bones of Shore Bank. Trouble at the bank, it make it hard to deploy new loans at that time. It's difficult at lending institutions of all sorts. But I'm proud of some of the business relationships we were able to continue to lend to. People doing good work, building housing in underserved communities, investing in neighborhoods that were most in need. And I'm also grateful to the ENF, the Endowment and Foundation clients that stood by us through that difficult period as well.
And just for our listeners who aren't familiar with some of the terminology, can you just explain what redlining is or was and some of the changes that have been made in that since?
Yeah, so absolutely. So banking regulations, or rather the home lending apparatus from at the federal level would dictate that certain neighborhoods were not worthy of being invested in or were to be actively avoided by lending institutions. So it was a really institution top-down level lack of access to capital in Black neighborhoods in Chicago, but then in other cities around the United States. Again, thinking back to that mid-century experience in the U.S. And so, Shore Bank, as a small, ultimately grew to be about $2 billion in assets, but really we're taking that sort of street corner and door-by-door approach to building equity and extending credit into these neighborhoods and overcoming some of those institutional barriers. And as you mentioned, fair housing laws have been changed to eliminate redlining officially, and Shore Bank played at least a minor role in moving that forward. So really a pioneering and important work done at the institution.
So you left there about 10 years ago, the bank. How, in your experience, has access to banking improved now for people in Black and brown neighborhoods? Is it at the level that it should be?
I think it's definitely improved. There's been heightened attention on the area for sure. And yes, certainly it's been a few years since I was actively in that space. But I think the attention and on the need for capital in underserved communities has certainly accelerated. And I think, mission investors, banking institutions, local governments have all focused on finding ways to unlock and focus capital into areas that have a need. Still more work to do, for sure. Yes, certainly times have changed and for the better, I think.
Moving now to the time you spent in the mayor's office, it seems that the Chicago mayor's office is always almost gets national attention, maybe because of the size of the city, because of the politics involved. Can you talk about your experience there and what it was like driving the agenda at a municipal level?
Yeah, Ethan, that's well said. I think, ultimately my experience at Urban Partnership Bank and at Shore Bank led me to joining the mayor's office. So my business experience, the sustainability background, and work on mission-focused work and community development made me a unique fit for the deputy sustainability officer role. To your point, what was it like? And what is that? Certainly there's so much attention on the office. Politically, it draws a lot of attention, and so I would say it was it really has made me empathetic, in fact, for allocators who work at some of our U.S. public pension plans, because there is so much attention and focus on what you're doing in a role like that, but you're very short of resources and bandwidth. So, I really learned how a government functions and why they make the policy decisions that they, and then the way that they make them, how to manage in uncertainty. There's a very uncertain, and there's a lot of uncertainty in a role like that. So, and how to get things done through influence and rather than by dictate, and most importantly, how to effectively communicate with audiences of all types. So it was incredibly challenging, but rewarding work. Certainly it was public service. I would say that it was a very challenging role, but also very, very rewarding. And as somebody, a native of the area, I just found it so gratifying. To be able to work and meet people from all across the city. It was a lot of fun. I'll never forget it.
Who was the actual mayor when you were in that role?
Yeah, so exactly. So that was Rahm Emanuel in his first term is when I was there. So he was returning from the White House at that time. And there were connections from the old Shore Bank to the Obamas, frankly. And that's what sort of, made that initial connection.
What would you say were the key sustainability challenges, I suppose, of a city like Chicago that you had to handle in your day to day? Well, where do you even begin?
Right. Well, it was they were broad, right? But the good news was is that there was a tremendous legacy already in place by the previous mayor, Richard M. Daley. Richard M. Daley had formed a Department of Environment, which was really pioneering for its time. And essentially, that office was formed out of settlement dollars from environmental lawsuits against ComEd and People's Gas. So they won millions of dollars from the two utilities for pollution and other environmental judgments against them. But the dollars had to be spent on sustainability topics. And so at that time, you're talking, that was the late 80s, early 90s. That was a very new sort of idea and field. And for a municipal government like a city, what do they do with those dollars was kind of a challenge. And so, that led to the creation of the Department of Environment. Those dollars ran out, though. So there was a great legacy and a lot of resources in the history, but there were not a lot of the same resources looking forward for the city. So, again, you're thinking about the brand and the attention that goes to something like the mayor's office in the city of Chicago is really intense, and the expectations are quite high. So we had to get more done with less, essentially. But we broadened the focus for sustainability and really attacked it from from 7 areas rather. We thought about economic development and job creation, clean job creation, energy efficiency and clean energy, water and wastewater, waste and recycling, parks, open space and healthy food, climate adaptation. So there was a number of different areas that we really emphasized. And transportation, I looked at transportation, and that was a big one for us. So there was a lot of work to be done, and we pushed really hard and got a lot done. So, energy efficiency benchmarking in big buildings, making solar easier, reducing barriers to permitting and entitlements around transit-oriented development and electric vehicle adoption. These are just some of the various ideas that we got to work on.
Well, certainly, having worked in a public pension plan in a city in Chicago, I do know that the dollars always run out, which is something that you said. It's not, you won't have to convince me of that. Let's move now to your role in real estate, where dollars don't seem to be running out, and there seems to be an abundant demand and quite a lot of activity in the real estate arena. Can you talk about your main areas of focus at Blue Vista? And then we'll maybe go into some of the dynamics across some of those sectors. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Blue Vista, we're value investors, fundamentally. The firm was founded nearly 20 years ago with a thesis focused on unlocking value in middle market real estate, which we define as deals with total capitalization of 50 million or under typically. And that segment of the market is 7 times the size of some more classically, institutional larger assets. So that all the large institutions are all competing for. And so that, that imbalance of demand from the institutions, leads to a small cap rate premium for smaller transactions. We observe that to be around 60 to 65 basis points, at least for relatively smaller transactions as compared with larger ones. So meaning on a weighted average basis, you'll observe a higher net operating income per square foot when comparing, a small deal to a large deal. So what we've seen, the dynamics though, over the last several years has been, search for yield that has persisted. And we've seen an increasing push by investors into non-gateway cities and niche asset types, or increasing appetite to explore these areas. And COVID more recently has really accelerated the use of technology, and that has changed the way that we live, work, and play. But as the pandemic wanes and things go back to normal, we think that we will go back to normal in many respects, but that normal will be different than it ever was before. So, more work from home, more flexible living arrangements, more use of the internet in everything that we do. And that is going to change the demand for space and leave, frankly, some assets stranded and leave and see, enduring demand for, new types of assets.
Just say we look at some of those stranded assets. What sort of way do you think they could be repurposed? And maybe can you give an example of where you think the biggest risk of stranded assets is?
Yeah, sure. So I think the biggest one where we're seeing the challenges have been in, I'd say, office, some retail, and also in some hotels. And so, let's start with office. I mean, that has been, tremendously challenged with central business districts and the lack of demand for some space. So Green Street, the research shop, they note that there's been a 15% demand drop across the board, and they see 5 years for that to recover. There always will be demand for trophy properties, but there are many more non-trophy assets out there that are at risk for obsolescence. And so, historically, as an office investor at Blue Vista, we've done a lot of office and had a lot of success with it. But looking forward, we're going to be very selective and look for opportunities with robust, consistent demand that we feel endure. And that'll be assets that feature lab space or R&D space, flex office that has a production or a light manufacturing component, things that can't be sort of arbed away, via a work for home, sort of arrangement. But thinking about, to your point about repurposing assets and adaptive reuse, in the retail sector, for instance, big box retail, we've seen repurposing big box retail into self-storage, right? So self-storage has been an area where we have seen really insatiable demand. It's grown in the wake of the new housing sort of development, and it's also become increasingly really a retail type product. An asset that used to be, cinder blocks behind barbed wire in seedier parts of town has now moved to the main street corner, where a woman household decision maker who makes the purchasing decisions feels safe, feels secure, and it's an attractive asset to visit. Actually the new generation of self-storage actually looks more like housing. It really mirrors the development of housing and really tracks the low cap rates that you see in housing as well these days. So, adaptive use is very challenging work. The zoning and entitlement of repurposing assets can be very, very challenging. So it takes a deft hand and a lot of skill and a focus. So when we invest with programmatic via programmatic joint ventures with specialists in local markets or property types, and that's how we really feel like we can find the best values as we select opportunities.
And do you see a lot of opportunity in student housing today? I know that's an area that is one of your sectors you cover.
Right. So the housing story is really interesting. Demand for housing has been insatiable out there, and there is a drain on new supply, which is getting absorbed more quickly than new listings can come online. So that is really creating an interesting dynamic in the market and making it very challenging out there, and really being very accretive and supportive of multifamily fundamentals. So it's a segment of the market out there that is really embracing being a renter by choice because it's so hard to buy homes, and they like the quality of single family living and single family housing in an amenitized community. So the build for rent, purpose built master plan community has been an area where we have been investing and have seen a lot of success. And there's been really a wave of capital coming into the area, but there's really a shortage of good opportunities, but there's really stable demand for housing. So that's a theme that we're going to continue to invest in, and we see has a very bright future. I think most importantly in that theme is going to be near good K through 12 schools, and I think there's also pressure from that when you think about housing, that there is a sort of a public policy angle that comes into that, as we touched on previously. But I think from the way that we're delivering the product, we're really competing with garden style apartments rather than the individual home buyers. So we feel like we're really finding a nice niche in that area with the purpose-built master planned development in housing.
And you mentioned something earlier about RV parks, which is just intriguing to me. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So RV parks, this has been an area where we've been recently investing. It's a tough market for institutions to access because the transactions are so small, routinely under $10 million in total capitalization. And so the idea is to aggregate up a portfolio and then capture a premium by rolling up a larger portfolio. But again, similar to the housing story, there is really strong demand and emerging demand for assets of this type. And it comes down to really a new way of doing recreation in the United States. I think we've all seen the numbers on, the production and the demand for recreational vehicles, Airstream trailers, RVs, all these big campers. They really flew off the shelves, and everybody bought these vehicles. So then there's a demand to go out and see the wonderful sites of around the country, and they're not institutionally owned in any sort of way. A very mom and pop sort of disaggregated ownership of the assets, and so we're very excited about acquiring assets in this space, and we feel like it's you have the benefits of a hospitality asset without any of the operational risk that is it's so hard to approach when you think about hospitality investing. So we really like RV parks as well.
It's not dissimilar from some of the holiday parks in the UK. I've heard about them. The kind of the I suppose more lodges, etc., camping sites, etc. They seem to have been in huge demand during the pandemic when nobody could travel abroad, and are also quite fragmented. So very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And student housing has been really robust in its demand as well. That has been an asset type that has been remarkably recession proof through the years. And we've seen through the pandemic, even as schools went online, that demand for for-profit private housing targeted towards students leased extraordinarily well. So in the depth of the pandemic, our portfolio lost perhaps a percentage point or two at most across the portfolio. And that was really driven by foreign national students who could not re-enter the country in the travel lockdowns in the depths of the pandemic. But overall, rent collection was really strong. We saw rental rate increases across the portfolio in a market where we were underwriting challenges where we'd see a 20% drop in income. So that just never materialized. We're very happy to say. So it's proven to be a very recession resilient type of asset, and the industry is saying it's pandemic proof now too. I think what we've seen though is there is a bifurcation going on. It's similar to the way that not all retail is going to survive, not all office is going to look so great. Student housing is the same. It faces somewhat of the same challenges where, having a very well located asset, you'll see the inelastic demand for rents in those types of assets. You may struggle if you're not at a premier institution where there's not as strong of a compelling value for the student who's paying the tuition or the parents who are paying the tuition. So you have to be very selective in when you select these opportunities, and the management of them is very hands-on as well. It takes a specialist. We have a strategic operating partner at Blue Vista solely focused on student housing as well. So we're specialists in that area.
That's very interesting. I just want to ask you also about getting back to your sustainability roots. Now that ESG risk is at the top of many investors' agenda, and latterly they seem to be extending that into private assets such as private equity, real estate. How much does sustainability feature as a layer that you look to when you're looking at the value proposition of an investment?
Yeah, we've seen increased demand and appetite for sustainability and real robust reporting from investors in sustainability. And I think, there's been some ascending themes. I mean, most principally has been the UN Principles for Real Responsible Property Investing, the UNPRI. So Blue Vista is a signatory there. GRESB and other rating systems, continue to ascend in importance as well. So that's it's certainly a real theme that is continuing to grow in importance. We see that demand from our investors, and we see the value as well. I mean, there are trade-offs, and this is an area I know a lot about. I've spent a lot of time on the policy side, and I think there's heavy investment in sustainability is more economically feasible for more expensive real estate, and when you're holding on a longer term basis as well. So that's sort of there's a tension there. But I think with investors and managers, I think via technology, I'm really pleased to see that there's progress being made. And I think Blue Vista is certainly learning and growing as we focus there as well.
And my last question about the industry is, what are your thoughts on the diversity of it? You mentioned growing up in a very liberal enclave, and there's a lot of diversity in Oak Park. I live here myself. And in the finances, and you've also cycled through public service, which tends to have a diverse representation. And what are your impressions across, say, the real estate investment industry of the level of diversity?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ethan. And so where I'm very pleased with the direction of the adoption of sustainability in the real estate and in ESG more broadly in asset management. at least in the real estate area, diversity, the state of the industry is really quite poor. There's not really any sugarcoating to it. I mean, it's a long-term, just because of the long-term nature of the real estate industry. Real estate is very relationship driven, and it's a highly networked business. And so, it's historically been a family business as well. So breaking into those networks has been extremely difficult. And the numbers bear that out. I mean, the Knight Foundation put out a report in December of 21 on the state of DEI in the asset management industry. And one of the conclusions that they had in that report was that that real estate has the lowest representation of both women and minority-owned firms in asset management. So, personally, I came from a very modest background, and so that's atypical, to say the least. And I would say, I've been very fortunate to have supportive mentors early in my career, and the luck of getting into a good business school that really sort of propelled things for me. I wouldn't be so lucky to be where I am today without that. Again, I think there's a lot of focus on it. I think there's a focus and a push. And I think, Blue Vista, to the credit of the firm, represents very well for diverse people at all levels in the organization. So that's a positive. But, broadly speaking, there's a lot of work to be done.
Just getting back to your personal journey now, were there any setbacks along your career? We talked about a lot of the successes, but were there any lessons maybe that you learned that you can share?
Yeah. So leaving my MBA studies in the financial crisis was a tremendous challenge. So, I made a career change from engineering, where I wanted to go to development and into the business side of real estate, and really knew nothing about what that really meant. And I was so glad and excited to, win a job with Morgan Stanley Real Estate, a very coveted role in acquisitions, underwriting deals for their MESREF series and the prime property funds. And seeing the Chicago office close down and being out of a job just months out of graduating was incredibly humbling. But that closed door led to having a front row seat for some interesting and unique opportunities to recap distressed assets, work on Shore Bank and forming a new bank holding company, and then ultimately to my work at the bank, at the mayor's office. So those challenges, you got to embrace them sometimes.
If they don't kill you, they make you stronger, for sure. So you mentioned a lot of some of the great people you've worked with, both in public service and now in the private sector. Are there any key people or mentors that you had throughout your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say, a key person, there's a couple of them. Paul Roldan he's the president of the Hispanic Housing Corporation, an affordable housing development company. He encouraged me to pursue my dream to get into real estate when I was, just out of school. He introduced me to the Urban Land Institute, which is an industry group related to land use, high quality group. And I learned a lot through that experience and found a way to get involved and build networks. That was critical. Another one would be Steve Koch, who is deputy mayor of Chicago, also a U Chicago MBA grad. And he gave me critical advice on how to make the big leap back from the public sector back into real estate. So those were two pivotal ones for sure. Of course, most importantly were my parents, who were my inspiration. But, Paul and Steve, always come back to those were pivotal moments, and they gave me great advice.
And speaking of advice, is there any key piece of advice, a word of wisdom that you've heard and lived by, or any creed or motto that comes to mind?
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't necessarily think about that on a daily basis, but I do think there is one that I always come back to, and that's, I studied Latin in high school. Oak Park River Forest High School had a Latin department. I think they still do. But one idea I always come back to is carpe diem. And essentially it comes down to, I think, there's only one today, so make the most out of it. And so that's a motivator for me, for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. I also like to seize the day, and it's been great to speak about you seizing opportunities from engineering to impact banking to the mayor's office. And thank you for your service there. And now into real estate opportunities with a sustainability angle. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much, Ethan. It's been a real joy.
I'm Ethan Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.